My name is Defne Ayas and I'm the director of Witte de Wit. I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening and welcome also Markus Miessen. He's not a stranger to Witte de Wit. In January 2012, we've invited him to actually work with us on the spatial design of the building, especially on this floor. So what you're sitting on is actually his studio's creation, the bleacher covered with the artificial grass, and also the yellow monolith in the other room with the 64 blocks. We have embarked on a collaboration to see how much we can open up Witte de Wit back to Rotterdam, back to the city. Also include more public programs and debates as part of our ongoing exhibition program here. Markus Miessen is an architect, he's a writer, and is also a prolific thinker. He just told me he's also the member of the European Cultural Parliament, but the founder of Studio Miessen, who focuses on cultural analysis and spatial design. He has published extensively, and amongst other titles, The Nightmare of Participation, and that's going to be really the focus of this evening, and Actors, Agents, and Attendants was his other publication. His work has been quite presented both in the architectural and the art context. So I've also had the pleasure to work with him as part of Performa in New York. And he has extensively advised governments, and within that capacity he's also worked with SCORE, when SCORE existed. He exhibited as well at Manifesta in Lyon and Venice, Guangzhou and Shenzhen biennials, and he is currently working on a major Kunsthalle project that was a former army bunker, like a military bunker. So without any further ado, I'll hand over your microphone to you.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I hope your teeth are feeling better. For those of you who don't know, she just came back from a kind of dentistry trip to Istanbul. So, is this okay? Yeah. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to have a kind of split presentation, as it were. I'm going to start with a reading, which I guess in the most direct way relates to the little summary with which this talk was announced. And then I'm going to go through a series of projects, and I decided to do the reading first because the projects may take about an hour to go through, and I thought maybe otherwise by that time you're probably going to be quite tired and the reading would probably make you fall asleep. So we'll start with that. And just maybe as a little context of where this writing is coming from, there has been a book that was published in 2010 called The Nightmare of Participation, which was recently translated into German also, and for that German edition, together with an economist from Zurich, I wrote a kind of new introduction, which is basically this version. So this was co-authored with Hannes Grasegger. From Cairo to Berlin to Occupy Wall Street, participation is the new opium of the people. When everyone takes part in everything, everything will be fine. Also says the holy doctrine of participation. But sometimes what's better is exactly the opposite. Everyone should be able to take part. The call to participation is the red thread of the history of political thought of our time, linking the protests on Wall Street to Cairo to the ballot boxes captured by the pirates of Germany. But participation is a concept in need of urgent repair. Sometimes such forms of democracy, in which everyone has a right to say in the matter, should be avoided at all costs. Not everyone should be invited to take part in decision-making processes. We propose that one should look at participation from the other way around, that is, exactly the other way around, as an autocratic model. In fact, the time has come to take a chance on more autocracy. In Germany, at least, participation is wildly romanticized. The middle seems to be lost as soon as one calls out, "Join us," on Facebook. And we're not talking about massive binge drinking. For the past decade or so, we've been experiencing an almost fundamentalist endorsement of civic participation under the mantle of participation. This enthusiasm is accompanied by grotesque harmlessness in creating the structures and basic conditions for so-called participation at both the national and local levels. For examples, as with, in Germany, Stuttgart 21, which we can talk about later if you like, or with newspapers such as Freitag, bursting with specious participatory ideas, or with a flood of participatory projects in the art world. It's as if participation itself has taken on a value all on its own. The disciples of this holy vision of participation are Germany's pirate party. For the time being, they appear to have ushered in our gentle Deutscher Arabischer Frühling, German Arab Spring, as Heinrich Wefing described in one of Germany's leading newspapers, Die Zeit. In reality, they are radical without even knowing why. For voting, they use their laptops, mostly through the voting platform Adhocracy. It offers up the possibility of voting in real time, just like a representative of parliament. The pirates' stipulated liquid democracy is meant to replace representative democracy, i.e. a half-democratic compromise in the eyes of the pirates, in favor of real participation with power. All access, uncompromised, here and now democracy, for every question a popular vote. This is the participatory dogma of the pirates. These orange activists see participation as voting via menu with the least possible personal effort or consequences. A feeble push of a button, an anonymous login. This is selectivism, the vision of an all-inclusive democracy inspired by the collaborative model Web 2.0, from Facebook to Wikipedia, where content is generated or edited by anyone at any time. In theory, it sounds wonderful. In reality, it's dreadful. The pirates have liquidized one of the foundational pillars of democracy, that is personal responsibility. Both on the level of the voter, who acts as an advocate for something with his real person, and on the level of the representative, who shows his face with every decision. What the pirates have neglected to see is that even in the holy grail of all participation idolatry, Wikipedia, the participatory illusion has quietly and furtively disappeared. That is, Wikipedia has contracted a disease through the contagion of participation. Useless for scholarship due to its liquid contents, in any case, this web encyclopedia is also becoming eventually useless to the normal user. Studies complain about the ever more endless entries, ever more incomprehensible terminology. The community of enthusiasts is diminishing. In fact, since 2007, the swell of Wikipedia entries has been shrinking. The era of total participation is over. In the meanwhile, Wikipedia has been under attack by an entire arsenal of undemocratic decision-making processes for critical situations. As so-called administrators have the power to completely negate editorial additions to entries of controversial political profiles on Wikipedia, if only to prevent edit wars that render the site useless, content can be changed by the minute. Important admins are known by name. And sometimes Jimmy Wales, the head of Wikipedia, has the last word. For example, when he deleted details from his own resume, going against the encyclopedia's set rules. Or when media saw John Seigenthaler used his influence to change the rules of Wikipedia, pressuring them to delete an entry about him containing defamatory content. Participation alone doesn't work. The best proof of this are those in the realm of politics who held fast to participatory dogma and then came nowhere near close to holding power. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood and the military have taken the reins. Occupy Wall Street sunk in embarrassing roundtable, all-inclusive discussions held on the island of Mallorca. And while the pirates lack concrete suggestions, they are rife with internal organizational quibbles and a continually changing leadership. What should the participatory vision lead to? Imagine what an edit war would mean to participatory pirate utopia. An editorial war in which our constitutional laws would be changed by the minute, or the regulations on access to weapons. It is nearly impossible to imagine how dangerous total democracy could be. It is a nightmare. In the best case, one that never comes true. We believe that such a holy vision, the idea that radically participative open models guarantee the optimal solution for all problems, is dangerous. Participation must be viewed without romanticism. Participation is neither a quality nor a solution, but rather an organizational model. Real democracy demands much more than just voting. In Parliament, ideas are created and heads are chopped off. Real participation is not innocent. In other words, participation is war. Like the political theorist Chantal Mouffe says, we should agree that we disagree and learn to productively live and deal with this situation. The basis for the worldwide call to participation lies in real conflicts. We demand a conflict-oriented practice that descends from the fashionable cyber-democratic mediation mania and accepts the fact that sometimes one person must take responsibility for a particular solution. Not because we doubt democracy, but because we don't want to end up in Harmonistan, a pseudo-participatory superficial democracy in which politicians shove all responsibility onto the online voting community. We have to turn the idea of participation on its head. Democracy is a continual process of democratization on the personal level. For this, everyone must sometimes grant power to an autocrat. Instead of viewing participation as an opening of the decision-making process that is dictated from above, one should see participation as an individual entrance strategy to power from down below, as a post-consensus method of getting in the door. Our join-in era of participation needs a new understanding of itself. Do it yourself instead of picking from a menu. Even if it seems that we're standing on the other side of the door of power, uninvited, we're still a part of the party. Okay, so we're going to take it from there, which I guess gives a little bit of an introduction where I stand politically in the context of what we're going to be talking about. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is that I'm going to give you kind of rough overview of the kind of projects that I've been working on since, roughly speaking, 2006. And some of those projects will be, one could kind of bluntly say, let's say, more discursive. So they're happening in this kind of weird in-between zone of design, which sometimes is physical and sometimes is not. And certain projects which also have an architectural scale to them. The reason why I've constantly been, in the last couple of years, been investigating this issue of participation and been talking about this for some time is that basically there is by now this kind of body of work that was really started with a project which was called Did Someone Say Participate? With my master's thesis in 2006, and then resulted in a book which I will talk about in a second. And it kind of, without really ever being planned in this particular way, it ended up as a kind of series of 4 books which are looking at the issue of participation in practice and beyond from, let's say, different angles. So you could say that the first one, which is an anthology, was really investigating practice through the term of participation. The second one was a kind of case study at a particular site, which was the biennial in Lyon. The third one, which is the nightmare of participation, is a kind of, let's say, theoretical overview of the thinking that came out of the 2 earlier projects. And the fourth one, which is called Waking Up from the Nightmare of Participation, is again, an anthology where then people from the outside reflect or criticize the thoughts that were being put forward in the Nightmare of Participation. And what I'm working on at the moment, as a kind of working title, it's called Crossbench Praxis. And it's the kind of, so to say, final part of this participation project for me, which is actually to come up with a model. So to say an actual role, like the development of a role that comes out of this kind of critique of the discourse around participation since the mid-90s. A role that, of course, with my background in architecture, relates also to the question of architecture and spatial practice, but it's not only looking at the world of, let's say, spatial production. And the way that this was really all started was basically through the question of whether, when we talk about participation, and especially, you know, participation since the kind of mid-90s when it became the buzzword also in the art world, was really the question, well, do we actually mean participation in the sense of the kind of, let's say, slightly romanticized post-69 idea of kind of bottom-up democracy, or do we mean maybe something else? And also, when we talk about participation, is it not important to also consider the context in which we mention it? Because in different contexts it has very different connotations, and in different practices, of course. And one thing that always worried me, especially at the time when I lived in the UK, which was between 2002 and 2008, and especially in the earlier years, which were really the kind of heydays of New Labour, there was a very interesting phenomenon going on, which was that, from my point of view, participation quite often was, rather than actually opening up the possibility for people to get involved in a kind of serious way, it was used as a platform to withdraw from responsibility by officially elected politicians. In other words, it was a kind of tool for political legitimization. And this particularly worried me in the UK. I mean, I'm sure we can also later, maybe in a discussion, talk about the situation in Holland, which it's also, I guess, not that easy. But that was also, for example, one of the things that really interested me, the idea or the notion of the polder model and how that comes into this whole debate around participatory modes of practice, especially those that are consensus-driven. But so one of the things that really, as I said, interests me is how one could possibly turn this around into kind of proactive and productive model where, rather than actually involving everyone, so in other words, let's say understanding participation as a mode to bring everyone around the table and making decisions collectively, how could one turn that also possibly into a model where you put it on its head and you as a kind of first person singular are the one that participates. So in other words, where you're forcing yourself into other contexts with a kind of conscience. And that is something that, from my point of view, works best when one actually acts without mandate, i.e. when one is not commissioned or asked to do something, but when one self-initiates different forms of practice. And then, of course, in this context, the question is, do those practices then have to be consensual or not? And to which extent can dissensus actually be also explored and developed as a productive mode of conflict? So the three kind of driving questions for the kind of current work in that regard are the question of responsibility. So in other words, how do we assume that responsibility? Question of authorship. In other words, how can we today work in kind of collaborative ways that actually take the notion of collaboration serious, in the sense that collaboration does precisely not equal cooperation. And the question of agency, and especially in architecture, I think the agency issue is one which is very dangerous because it's very often misinterpreted, because in those contexts the architect is often being understood as the good doer. So someone who has to work for the greater good with a kind of social conscience, which of course, when we talk about it in these kind of banal terms, it sounds good, and I would also be a great supporter, of course, of social work. But quite often it's actually also used in order to legitimize certain other practices. And there's a German word which I'm very fond of and that I like a lot, which is Einmischung, which I've looked for many years for like a proper translation, which I can't find a translation into English. But it's some kind of breed of word between those kind of three terms. So it's some kind of proactive practice. It's about getting involved, and the notion of practicing as a productive irritant. And one political biography that, from my point of view, reflects this term of Einmischung very well is the biography of Joschka Fischer, who I'm sure some of you have come across in the past. He was the, in his kind of most prominent role, or his last kind of major political role, was the foreign minister under the Schröder government in Germany. And the reason why I find him interesting is that of a role that I've kind of described as the uninvited outsider. And it's something that to me is interesting because it really relates to this notion of Gramsci's Long March Through the Institutions, which of course is a kind of, let's say, leftist claim. But for me what was very interesting is that someone who precisely comes from the left and actually takes that claim serious, and at least to my knowledge is really the only one in terms of a biography, even on a kind of international scale, who really went through all those institutions and really made it from kind of nothing to like a political leader. He was actually the one who was most prominently criticized by the left in Germany. So that is not only his own party, the Green Party, but also, for example, the Labour Party. And it's very interesting because his, for those of you who don't know, I mean, he dropped out of high school when he was 16. He became a cab driver. He never studied, but in the '68 student revolution in Frankfurt, he was one of the kind of leading figures, who then later on became one of the leaders of the German Green Party and also their first minister on a kind of in a regional government. And I mean, as you can see in the photographs, towards the end became kind of major kind of German political player on an international scale. So you have someone who has not finished high school and used to work as a taxi driver professionally, so to speak, but he ends up, before he drops out of his professional career, as an honorary professor at Princeton University. Which I find quite interesting, and especially from the point of view that he actually made it, but then becomes the kind of canvas for critique, so to speak. So here I'm showing a series of images which one could say are all in one way or another talking about the issue of participation, different kinds of projects, some of them in the art world, some of them not. But the image that really interests me is this image on the top left, which is this one, which is an image from the House of Lords in the UK, which of course is a super conservative kind of political setting if one thinks about it formally. But I'm interested in it from the point of view of structure. So both in terms of organizational structure, but also in terms of spatial structure. So these guys that you see sitting in the middle, they're the ones that really interest me, and they're called the crossbenchers. So they are essentially independent politicians that don't belong to a particular party, so they're neither Tories, i.e. Conservatives, nor Labour, but they're inhabiting some kind of strange middle ground. They're also not, as usual in the House of Lords, they haven't been, they don't assume their seat because of, let's say, family heritage or family lineage, or because they've been knighted by the Queen, or later they would be knighted, but the original kind of reason why they're there is because somebody made a decision about them being relevant in terms of the content that they represent. And the most interesting thing for me structurally is that they don't have to hold any consensus to any of the parties. So they're like kind of like free floating radicals in a way. Now that of course sounds great, but at the same time this is like the most conservative setting in the UK, and if not in Europe. So please do not misunderstand this as some kind of political gesture or some political interpretation, but on a more abstract scale, the idea of how one can intervene between the seats, so to speak, literally. And of course here we also see that the arrangement is kind of organized in a slightly different way. So this gives a kind of rough idea of some of the things that are being discussed in this publication, The Nightmare of Participation. And this whole series was really started through this project which I described earlier, Did Someone Say Participate?, which is an anthology that I co-edited together with Shumon Bazar. And we also today have one of the contributors here, Frank van der Zaan, which is fantastic that you're here. And basically what we try to do with this project is to give an overview of projects and discourses that from our point of view reflect a kind of alternative to, and when I say, I mean of course now it's 2012 and this happened in 2006, so there has been some time passing, and of course maybe one wouldn't do it exactly the same way, but I think what was important at the time for us was to really show or to investigate what are the kind of critical spatial practices that go beyond the notion of architects as the producers of space, and what are the kind of critical possible reflections of spatial practices. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples from the book. This is an example that I'm sure many of you know, Women on Waves. This is floating abortion clinic, which was organized and devised by Rebecca Gompertz. And the image that you see here is an image that was taken off the coast of Australia with the two Navy vessels trying to stop the ship from entering territorial waters. So the idea of this project is that the ship basically goes to countries where abortion is illegal, enters the territorial waters, picks up women from the shore, and then exits into international waters. This is a project by a colleague of mine who runs a project for UN, for one of the UN field offices in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish areas. And it's a project where these kind of practitioners, if you want, or these kind of activists and field workers are called deminers, which of course is a kind of commonly known practice. They're basically ridding their way through the field in order to rid it of mines. But of course this is an image that we see a lot. There's also other images that we could imagine to see, for example, tanks going through fields and getting rid of mines. But what was important for us here was to also maybe understand ourselves, but also to show that in this case a spatial practice can also consist of something that, rather than adding something, it's actually about the removal of something, and by or through that removal you actually create a different reality which then becomes a ground for potential change, i.e. that those fields can again be used in order to either plant food or to build villages and so on. This is a project by Israeli architect and theorist Eyal Weizmann, who also I'm sure some of you have come across. He's the director of the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths in London, and as a kind of thesis project was working on, let's say, a form of alternative visual notations of some of what he calls the politics of verticality in the West Bank. And what was interesting to us, or what I hope was interesting to everyone within this project, but what was kind of important for us to show here is that not even to go into the detailed politics of the project, but to show that basically an architectural tool, which is drawing, can be used in order to make very precise kind of mappings that can actually completely change the way that you look. And when I say you, I mean people that are usually not used to looking at those types of drawings. That a precise drawing like this can actually unearth or unveil a reality that was previously not visible. And it's quite interesting because it was originally commissioned, it was his idea, but was then through a series of drawing projects also commissioned through a human rights organization called B'Tselem. And at this stage, of course, nobody really knew where this was going to go, but by now these drawings and these sets of drawings are being taken really serious and even are being referred to by the UN. So it has become a kind of official protocol in itself. There's also photographic projects in the publication, like this one, for example, by Mexican artist Mauricio Gillen, who looked at a particularly wealthy neighborhood in Mexico City, which is his hometown, where he concentrated or focused on the security architecture or security booths of the security companies who are looking after these kind of, let's say, affluent private houses that you can see in the background. And what he was particularly interested in was to show that the kind of eye of the security observer, so to speak, is actually in terms of a kind of architectural aesthetic reflecting the formal aesthetic of the building or house that it's supposed to secure. There's a project by Armin Linke, who was looking at the Davos summit and the way in which during the summit the entire village essentially becomes a kind of high security zone, and how the military basically takes over that part of the valley. The second part of the project, which was called later in the publication The Violence of Participation, was a project that was taking place at the Lyon Biennial in 2007. And the biennial was set up as a kind of history book of the 00s, basically. So the idea was that all the projects that were taking place at the biennial would, in one way or another, focus on that first decade of the 21st century. And I hope I'm not saying something wrong here, but I think from the point of view of the curators, the idea was that one would speculate on kind of different futures based on that first decade, the 00s. And what we thought was particularly interesting at this point in time was that it was at a moment when two of the referenda for the European Constitution had just failed. And we started speculating in a kind of silly way on what may be the reasons of why these referenda could have failed. And one of the reasons that we came up with was that it's probably quite difficult to make a decision about something that as a space you cannot envision, or a space that you cannot actually imagine, or that maybe you wouldn't even be able to draw, even if you just had to do a line drawing of what that space may be. And so what we did was that with this hypothesis in mind, we asked, or rather invited, all the 50 contributing artists of the biennial, plus another 50 cultural producers and writers, philosophers, and so on around the world, to send us some form of visual representation of their spatial perception of Europe. And these drawings that you can see in the back, on the back wall, are basically those 100 spatial imaginations, one might say. and they've all been produced prior to the biennial, and on this kind of wonky looking yellow table, which is in a way you could say the exact opposite of a round table, since rather than it being a kind of invitation to some kind of consensual discussion, it actually produces individual booths, like a ballot booth, in which the audience then of the biennial was supposed to take those pre-produced drawings and start to corrupt them with their own kind of thoughts on what Europe may be about spatially. Which of course, I mean, you also have to remember this was at a time when there were constant discussions about kind of the expansion of the Union, and actually also some of the countries joining at that moment constantly changed the kind of political and geographic, or rather topographic geography of Europe. So it was a very exciting moment, at least for us. And the audience would then take those kind of changed or corrupted or hijacked drawings, which started to create a conflict with the original renderings of the invited contributors, and would overlay them with the originals. These are some of the originals. These were some of the images or drawings that were produced for the book, or not for the book, but were in the book, sorry. So these were, of course, produced at the biennial, but they were then later also part of the book. So for those of you who are interested in this, there's also a kind of online database of about 2,000 of those drawings at a Paris-based institution called Saint-Quatre. And so there was also then a publication coming out of this, which tried to, in a way, emulate the same kind of way of working, but through conversations. So rather than looking at kind of the visual language as one which can then uncover these kind of different realities by individuals or collectives, here the idea was to always juxtapose two potentially conflicting voices, and also invite people to talk about Europe who we would, for example, not politically agree with. So rather than, let's say, just inviting the kind of usual suspects, whether in philosophy or artists or other forms of, let's say, cultural producers, we thought that there should be some kind of divide between both the kind of thinking that takes place, but also the political motivations and belief systems that a person stands for. So, I mean, I'm personally like an absolutely kind of pro-Europe person, like I'm a big supporter of Europe, but we, for example, also invited the leader of the anti-Europe League in the European Parliament, who's essentially kind of right-wing asshole. So anyway, this is just to give a little bit of a kind of idea, but the idea was that here to give two examples of how these kind of conflicting voices could also come together, maybe not so much politically, but in terms of, let's say, individual lineage and background. So on the right you can see Chantal Mouffe, with, I'm sure most of you are familiar with her work, political theorist based at Westminster University, who basically is the kind of key protagonist or defender of the kind of theory that she coined, which is the theory on agonism. And on the left, this is Oscar Kilave, who was my mountain guide on Kilimanjaro, who's never left Tanzania, but is constantly in touch with Europeans who basically pay him €800 to climb on his mountain. So the idea was there to have, of course, two kind of crazily different perceptions of Europe. One of a person who's completely embedded in the kind of history, philosophy, and kind of discursive recent history of both the term Europe, but also all the discourses around it. And one person who has actually never touched foot in the geography of Europe, and who has kind of also not access, for example, to the internet, but whose rendering of a geography is purely based on oral history, and also of a very particular kind of oral history, which is that of essentially rich, or at least kind of half-wealthy people who go there on holidays, who are able to spend 800 euro to climb on a mountain. And one thing that was interesting about this project was that immediately out of this project came a commission, which was taking place under the mandate of the government of Slovenia during their European presidency of the EU Council in 2008, in the first 6 months of 2008. And this was done in collaboration with School of Missing Studies, which is a collective based in New York, and specifically with Serjan Jovanovic-Weiss and Catherine Carl. And I mean, it was a really kind of strange project because they basically enjoyed the idea of some of the issues that were discussed in the Lyon project, but they essentially gave us carte blanche. So they just said, okay, there's 6 months that we have the presidency of the EU Council, and there's always these kind of cultural projects that are being run alongside it. And why don't you curate the New York, because most of the events actually take place in New York because of the United Nations. So why don't you curate that kind of section of the cultural program? And so our immediate kind of response to this was that it's kind of interesting that we're talking about Europe, but we're doing it from the point of view and perspective and geography of the East Coast of the United States. So for a moment we decided, okay, well, why don't we come up with a really silly kind of hypothesis or statement, which is that let us imagine for a moment that Europe had an East Coast, i.e. that Europe was a kind of floating island, and that red line that you can see on the right would precisely be considered as that East Coast. And if you actually start drawing that East Coast, I mean, of course you could always argue that any kind of political body that also holds a geography will always have a kind of edge, no? So maybe we don't need to call it coast, but it could also be called edge, it could be called anything. But for us, the important thing was to really consider, okay, if you draw that line, then you actually really start to think of what's on the other side of that line, if you do that as a kind of conscious gesture. And for us, it was much more interesting to consider the east of that European line, so in other words, the East Coast Europe, which was also the title of the project, and to consider, for example, questions like, you know, at this time it was being discussed whether Turkey, for example, should join the Union, and for us this was super interesting because, of course, if that would happen, then the European Union would have an immediate geographic and physical border with Iran, and that these kind of questions would then actually turn into very interesting discourses that could be produced, and where projects like this could possibly help to start kind of triggering other kinds of conversations. Which was then, I'm not going to go into this was one of the side projects that happened in Berlin. But basically what we then did was that we set up a series of events in New York City, 2 at the New School and 1 at the New York Public Library, where we basically invited protagonists from both of these, what we call the 2 East Coasts. So we always try to bring people from this imaginary East Coast of Europe, so from the other side of that East Coast, together with people or protagonists from the East Coast of the US. Which, again, I mean, you have to imagine this all happened in 6 months, so it was kind of incredibly difficult to produce something so quickly. And we also produced a book at the end, but the idea was really that, because this also had to be produced within 6 months, that this would not be a kind of, let's say, thoroughly researched or kind of heavily academic book, but it would almost work as a kind of magazine that would bring together or present the kind of things that had been happening in those 6 months. And that could also be read as a magazine, so you wouldn't actually have to take it so serious. And the idea was not that it necessarily becomes a kind of object in your library, but that it kind of also assumes a kind of different form of distribution. Like sometimes, you know, when you have a magazine lying on your sofa and a friend comes to your house and starts reading and asks, well, can I take it with me? And then it kind of starts to be distributed in a kind of slightly different way. Which for us was actually also very interesting in terms of considering the actual physical production of the book, because there was a budget that was not bad, but it was also not great to produce the book. And of course the idea of the government was that we would produce this kind of really pristine little kind of hardcover art world glossy publication with a print run of maybe like 800 or 1,000 copies. And so we basically proposed to them that we would do the exact opposite, so that we would do research on where you could do the possibly cheapest printing, and we would then produce as many copies as we could to think about different forms of distribution. So we were really surprised because we thought it would either be somewhere in Eastern Europe or the Far East, but actually it was in Denmark where you could do the cheapest printing. So it's these kind of pulp fiction type novels, the kind of stuff that you buy at the airport for $5 and then you probably throw it away after 2 weeks. And you could basically do a 333-page book for 43 cents per copy, which meant that we could print 8,000 rather than 1,000, and which in the end meant that we could also convince them that only 2,000 of those would go into mainstream distribution through a publishing house, which was Stermark Press. And all the other copies would be channeled into different forms of distribution. So some of them would be kind of individual distribution, just literally giving them to friends, and they would make sure that they get rid of 50 copies. But also, for example, at these kind of launch events like this one at the Swiss Institute in New York, where we would just put 1,000 copies on a Euro pallet and you could just take them, which then also people did, and which of course now may seem a little bit silly, but it actually really created a more kind of, it's kind of like the physical version, I guess, of some kind of like online viral network of distribution. One project that I wanted to show in the context of this notion of the uninvited outsider and the question of also kind of academic discourses and how they can be kind of forcefully located into different contexts is a project that I've been working on since 2007, which is called the Winter School Middle East, which I started in Dubai, but now has been moved to Kuwait 2 years ago. And I have to tell you a quick story in order to somehow contextualize where this is coming from. In 2007, there was a conference, which was this one, called the International Design Forum in Dubai, which was a highly dodgy kind of urban design conference, which was very kind of exclusive in terms of access, because you would have to pay $1,000 to be allowed in there. But still there would be 800 participants, and those would mainly be representatives of kind of big international architectural and urban design offices, but not the kinds of, Gehry or Zaha or OMA, but the kind of ones that you've never heard of, but they have all 3,000 architects per office. And they were, of course, after the kind of big urban projects at that time, which, of course, in 2007, this was really like the heyday in the Emirates. The conference was organized by a government think tank in Dubai, and they basically commissioned 2 publications. One was AMO's publication Almanac, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which is this book on the left, which is a kind of study of the Gulf region in a typical OMA-AMO fashion, which is essentially from a satellite trying to understand urban development over a kind of trajectory of time. And so we did, or what we decided to do, as a kind of a counterpoint to that, not at all in order to criticize it, but in order to try to show the backside of that in many ways, was to look at the wider region and the kind of spatial production in the region purely from the scale of the street and the person on the ground. So we devised this kind of almost like a kind of children book structure with these really blunt typologies like house, courtyard, museum, square, all these kind of architectural urban typologies, and then there would always be one written contribution and one visual contribution for each of those sections. And this was done in collaboration with Bidun magazine, and to cut the story short, when those books were supposed to be presented at the International Design Forum, which was also basically the venue where each of the people that would pay the $1,000 would get a copy for free of the book. It was a very interesting situation because you see here a photograph of a panel which was about strategizing urban development, especially in terms of public infrastructure and transport. There would be 800 people in the audience if you would turn the camera around, so it was completely full. And then the next morning, when the publications were presented, there were literally 8 people in the audience. And of course, you could also say that makes total sense because, of course, here there's a kind of immediate kind of, there's a certain interest which represents also certain capital flows, let's say, and here there's not. It's essentially, it's maybe not even critique, it's essentially observation that's being put forward in the context of a publication, so why bother? But the reason why I'm showing this is that what was really interesting for us was that every single time we would go out in the courtyard to smoke a cigarette, there would always be these like huge amounts of students coming and wanting to start conversations. And these were, of course, the students that couldn't eventually enter the hotel because they couldn't pay the $1,000 to be part of this. And so in a weird way, what was kind of doomed to be a kind of dodgy conference actually turned out to be super interesting because after the first day, we pretty much spent the next 48 hours in the courtyard and had conversations with the students who all felt that, of course, there's universities and so on in the region, but that there were no kind of smaller institutional or non-institutional kind of smaller scale platforms where ideas could be exchanged in a more let's say a space in which conversation is really possible. And at this time I was teaching at the AA in London, and when I went back I was kind of hoping that basically with the help of the AA I could set up a kind of small program there that would then start to actually establish that platform, which actually in the beginning I did. So 2 of those workshops in January, which was then called the Winter School rather than the Summer School, because of course in the Emirates or in general in the Gulf region it's very important to do such kind of things in the winter because it's the only time when you can actually walk in the city in terms of climate. So at the time when those 2 kind of first workshops happened in the winter, it was actually turned out to be very problematic because, of course, then also the AA started to charge fees, and it turned out to be problematic. There was a discussion with the director, and I decided to no longer do it with the AA, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But so, just to give you a kind of idea of the kind of issues that we've been looking at, the way that the Winter School is structured is that basically every year there's an annual theme. In the beginning, when it was still done in collaboration with the AA, it was pretty straightforward because there would basically be one annual theme, but that annual theme would essentially be only explored once, which was at the Winter School in January. But the way it's structured now is that there's kind of programming throughout the year, and we look at the annual subjects from different kind of perspectives throughout the year. But the first one in 2008 was looking at the issue of labor camps, which of course is a very interesting issue, especially in Dubai, much more so than in, for example, Abu Dhabi or Sharjah, because this is the city with the highest percentage of construction laborers, migrant construction laborers, and the absolute majority of those laborers are living in those, this is not a word that I'm coining, labor camps, but it's actually something that even the construction companies are using. And it's very interesting, was very interesting for us because it's of course a topic which has been written about a lot, basically since 2003, 2004, but always with the same kind of intentions and kind of regurgitated arguments used by Western journalists, most of them who actually haven't been to the region, which was to talk about it purely from the point of view of labor exploitation. And so our ambition, let's say, for the workshops and the different kind of study groups was to really understand those kind of habitats inside out and really spend time there. And also to think about the kind of possibilities that this may have. I mean, of course, not a possibility in terms of developing this further, but instead of just talking about this in a kind of Western-driven kind of negativity, how could one actually deal with this situation productively? So what could be potential drivers for change? And one of the groups which was actually directed by an architect and a novelist. And I should also say what's very important to understand about the idea of the winter school is that we always bring together one outsider and one insider. So we always, for each studio that's being taught, there's always one local, and that local is being teamed up with a kind of international protagonist who's being brought in. So this particular group, although it, of course, as a kind of school is concentrating, let's say, on architectural and urban questions, but this school was mainly taught by a novelist, and the entire studio was using as a kind of format and means of investigation the issue of oral history in order to experience not only the immediate kind of physical context of the labor camps, but to really investigate labor as a phenomenon in Dubai. Because, of course, in Dubai what's interesting is that almost everyone is an outsider, because there's, in a city which at the time was 1.3 million people, there's only 35,000 people with an Emirati passport, so essentially everyone is a kind of migrant. And also what's interesting is that there are, of course, huge kind of differences, like social differences, and you could say almost class differences and housing differences and so on. But the one thing where everyone is being treated equal is in terms of their contracts for work. So it doesn't matter actually if you're a construction worker from Bangladesh or a Russian prostitute or a South Korean mobile phone dealer or a British investment banker working for HSBC, you're all essentially on the same kind of temporal contract. And you're also exposed to the possibility of being kicked out at any one time. And so basically what this particular group did was that they ran 64 conversations with precisely those kind of different individuals. So they would basically do conversations with people throughout the whole social spectrum of Dubai in order to investigate this issue. So, as I've said, the structure has changed severely. So now, in 2010, I managed to register the Winter School as a non-profit organization both in Kuwait and in Germany, which is a very simple reason for also doing it in Germany. It means that I can tap into funding, like public funding, that otherwise, for example, in Kuwait, we wouldn't be able to get. especially the kind of funding that also allows to bring people, especially students, for free. So when we now, for example, also have students, I mean, there always used to be international students, but in the beginning there was always this issue that you would pretty much know that, or you would know about the kind of backgrounds that they're coming from, because they would be able to pay, you know, the flights and the accommodation and so on, which actually in the region's not so cheap. But now we can actually give scholarships, and we can also bring people for free, which is great. So the thing is that basically now the way it works is that we have a kind of space for 3 years in Kuwait, which is in collaboration with the Cultural Council, and allows us to really explore in a kind of longer term subjects with more depth. And one of the kind of ongoing themes that we're investigating is spatial political typology called Diwania, which you can see here an image of one of the more, let's say, informal urban Diwaniyas. And of course, if we look at this as an image at first, it doesn't look at all kind of surprising or special, or just looks like kind of everyday tea house or cafe. One would probably, with kind of European eyes, one would probably say that this is what that is. But it's actually a very interesting typology, which is totally engraved in the history of Kuwait and the region. I mean, there's different kind of, let's say, interpretations of that practice. In Kuwait, it's known as Diwania. In Dubai or the Emirates, for example, it's known as Majlis. But it essentially is born out of the kind of nomadic traditions of what happens when two paths cross. And this is, of course, like when you're kind of on tracks in the desert, like back in the 19th century, and even before, of course. And if two paths would cross and you would set up tent, this would basically become the moment of when information and knowledge can be exchanged. And this would also be the moment for gossip, and this would also be the moment in which historically men, of course, would create a space for themselves so that they could exchange information, which is also very interesting because historically in the region both males and females have very distinct spatial typologies that they're using. So the courtyard is the female space and the Diwania is the male space. And what's very interesting is actually that the Diwania by now as a typology is one which is always attached to buildings, so it's always on the outside, so the man actually never penetrates, so to speak, the house. And the female typology of the courtyard is one where you first have to penetrate the house. So these spaces are super important in terms of the political decision-making process of Kuwait. And in the city of Kuwait, and the country of Kuwait and the city of Kuwait, because it's essentially a city-state, there's 4,000 of those spaces, and they range, I mean, incredibly from super formal, super affluent to super informal and, let's say, super problematic in terms of kind of economic backgrounds. This, as you can probably guess, is one of the very affluent places, and all these still images that I'm showing here, they are part of a documentary that we produced, which was very kindly paid for by the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And this is a family Diwania, which from the outside looks like this, so it also has these kind of two realities, one which is this one, which is for meetings and congregations during the day, and one which is the one that you can use at nighttime. And what's very interesting about these kind of settings is that although they have a certain, let's say, formal quality to them, so they look like so super organized, they're actually totally informal or informally organized in terms of everyday practice. So some of them take place once a week, but some of them, they're almost functioning as a kind of, just a kind of social meeting spot, like a cafe, or I guess in Europe you could also say a bar. And what's also interesting is the way that conversations take place is that even if they're about super important and super kind of relevant and serious issues, they're being discussed in very informal terms and often supported, for example, by games. This is an example of exactly the same kind of structure, just in one of the refugee camps on the outskirts of the city. And politically, what's very interesting is that all these 4,000 spaces, which are, although all the same typology, of course very different in the way in which they kind of spatialize, they have the same kind of reason of existence, which is that on a local scale, like you could say, for example, historically the pub in Great Britain, the idea of the public house as a kind of public living room would be a space where you talk, and it's also historically very much bound to your local neighborhood. In the same way, these diwania spaces are supposed to become a kind of voice of the kind of local, so to speak. And what's very interesting is that even in these kind of very informal situations, information is always kind of trickling up vertically, let's say, in the kind of political decision-making processes. And there's also a very kind of clear structure of formal political representatives that on an average basis go and visit those spaces in order to trickle the information up. And even on the kind of most formal scale of political decision-making, which is this one, which is the Parliament of Kuwait, the spatial arrangement, i.e. these kind of spaces, are even the same in the Parliament. And this is how conversation takes place. What was also for us very important was to use this kind of opportunity of the production of the documentary as a way to also, let's say, kind of introduce females to those spaces, which is, you can imagine, very difficult, and historically was, at least until 2006, unheard of. So it was actually never a typology that females penetrated. But what was also very interesting for us was that in the last election, or before the last election, actually 3 women who wanted to become representatives, i.e. parliamentarians, they used as a kind of lobbying device for the series of pre-election events the fact that they would basically, in an almost kind of bully way, force their way into Diwania. So they would just enter those spaces and start talking to the guys sitting there. And amazingly, this was their kind of way into parliament. So they actually got elected and became the first 3 female representatives in Kuwaiti parliament. And so the woman who's standing with the back to you or to the photographer is Zara Ali Baba, who's the co-director of the Winter School. She's an Iranian national, but grew up and has been pretty much most of her life living in Kuwait. This is one of the kind of presentations of the 2-channel film that we produced about these different spaces. There was a series of other projects that came out of this as a kind of side project. One of them was together with Joseph Grima, taking place in New York, which was a kind of newspaper project, and so on. These are just a couple of images from the Winter School kind of in action. So we always inhabit different spots in the city in very kind of informal ways for the discussions, almost also including kind of food and the possibility to invite other people in the city who are interested in joining discussion. A completely different project that I wanted to show, mainly because of the way in which a publication can actually become a really strategic tool for imagining different kinds of possibilities, is a project called the European Kunsthalle, which took place in Cologne between 2004 and 2007, which some of you may know of because of Nikolaus Schaffhausen, who was actually the founding director. And I would claim, and I'm sure if some people are watching this online, they might get pissed off about this, but pretty much after Nikolaus left, the European Kunsthalle basically died. I mean, it still exists, but the ambition is pretty low or mediocre, and it's not really being taken forward in a kind of serious manner. But what I want to talk about in the context of what I'm presenting tonight is this idea or issue of institution building, which also, of course, relates to the Winter School, and how one can imagine alternative types of institutions, which this book, which was a result of the project that we did together with Nikolaus, was really investigating the possibility of a kind of different institution to come out of an institution which was formerly like super formal, super established, and was part of, let's say, the kind of formal canon of at least German, if not European, artistic production. But because there's not enough time, I'm just going to show 4 images to give you a very quick overview of what happened there. So there was this fantastic Kunsthalle building in Cologne, which was not only a fantastic building architecturally, but also as an institution was really a space where not only for the Rhineland area in Germany, but also in a more kind of national and international, or at least kind of European scale, very important things happened throughout the years. But after the city of Cologne decided to take it down, they had previously promised the Kunsthalle that they would get a space in a building that would be erected afterwards. But what happened was that actually there was never a building that was erected afterwards, because the city decided that there was actually no money for this new building. So not only was the city left with a scar in its urban fabric, but also a scar in its kind of institutional landscape, which then kind of provoked a reaction by a group of pretty kind of widespread cultural producers, one could say, artists, curators, philosophers, sociologists, architects, and urban planners, who started a foundation which originally was called Das Loch, which means the hole, and then through a process of an auction managed to get a kind of substantial funding budget for a kind of institution that was supposed to follow the institution that had just been destroyed, which as a working title had the name European Kunsthalle. And just these 2 images I'm going to show you to introduce to you the first 2 projects that we did or co-organized and kind of devised the kind of spatial strategy for, which was in 2006 a 30-day symposium which was spread all over the city center of Cologne, and in 2007 a show, i.e. an exhibition that was decentrally organized in Cologne, which was called Models for Tomorrow, and which through a series of 22 spaces envisioned how an institution could work on an urban scale without having any form of physical institution itself. So there wasn't any kind of structure to work with. One could of course say that, okay, that's not anything new, to put it very bluntly, because of course things like Art Angel and other types of organizations exist that also don't necessitate a kind of physical home, so to speak, of the institution, but that simply exist as a kind of organization, and that can then start to organize spaces according to their needs or according to their shows, and especially what the artist may require in terms of a commissioned work. But in our case, the question was really how this can start to activate a different part of the city, and especially what we call these kind of post-public spaces. So unfortunately now there's not really the time to go into this, but the idea was to really activate spaces, from bordellos to mosques to public car parks and call centers, and even kind of ministry buildings, to create these kind of conflicts in the city, especially in terms of the different timetables that those different buildings that would be used for the different works would usually be based on. So there would also not be one timetable that would work for the whole loop, but certain spaces, for example, would work, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but other spaces may only be open from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. or from 1 a.m. until 8 a.m. And now I'm just quickly going to take you through a series of projects that are dealing with the issue of staging, which, as you're sitting on one of those things, it's something that very much interests me, and something that at the office we're dealing with at the moment in kind of various degrees and scales. And the question of how these, what we call kind of cultures of assembly, can actually start to create different settings for different kinds of discourses and conversations. This is maybe some of you have actually been to this. One of the actors, agents and attendants conferences that SCORE organized 2 years ago, and then last year there was the second edition to that we added together with Andrea Phillips and Fulya Ademci. And for the first setting especially, we thought that would be interesting, especially in this very kind of historic venue, to really rethink the way in which the different panels or speakers would be able to address the audience, and how the audience may be able to react. So instead of having a kind of, let's say, linear form of presentation in terms of direction, we decided that this would be organized in a kind of 4-part setting, so that you would have these kind of 4 different arrangements with a kind of super formal soapbox to kind of V bleacher and a formal setting for conference. The idea was that with every particular speaker or presenter, the format of the chosen speaker would dictate the kind of architectural response of the typology of presentation settings. So this one, for example, which would be Beatrice Colomina giving a kind of single-authored lecture, would be held in this super formal, almost kind of preacher-like manner. And then with every other one, it would then rotate according to the different needs of the speakers. But the most important thing was that, of course, with every turn, so to speak, or with every move, or with every next speaker or group of speakers within the chronology of the event, the audience had to readjust their seating according to the direction of the speaker, which sounds a bit stupid, but and maybe one could also say that maybe it failed miserably. Unfortunately, I can't really tell because I didn't do a lot of kind of questionnaires or something like this. But for us, at least, the hypothesis of this was that basically through creating those kind of instigated mini conflicts throughout the event, you would actually also engineer conversations, or even if they're kind of annoyed conversations, between people that are sitting maybe within the vicinity of each other, but would usually not talk to each other at a conference like this. And also to create this imbalance of, you know, I mean, right now in this space, there's a very kind of clear stratification of who sits in the back and who sits in the front. I'm not making this claim about you in the back right now, but there's also, of course, always this issue of people sitting in the back that they want to make sure that by no means do they have to talk to anyone. So, of course, in a situation like this, the moment it turns, it changes completely the power relationship within the audience. So you could see, for example, with a setting like this, which was super straightforward kind of panel situation, it would change. Then you would have situations like this where sometimes the bleacher would be used for almost kind of performative-like situations, or sometimes for one-on-one conversations. And we were left with this kind of complete chaos, which, if you remember, started from this kind of totally anal situation, which was actually, this was not our idea, but it was told to us by the health and safety administrators of Amsterdam, who came 1 hour before the opening of the event with this kind of white tape and marked out the spaces that we could put the chairs. Project that was in many ways dealing with a kind of similar question was a project that we did for Manifesta 8 in Murcia, which was a project that actually took place prior to the biennial, and which brought together a series of individuals and collectives that prior to the biennial had a discussion about the relevance of biennials today, which took place in a film studio in Murcia, was then filmed by a Turkish artist who was then also presenting those kind of clips, or let's say distilled moments of the conversation in the actual setting of the post office, which was one of the venues in Murcia, where then the setting, which actually relates to the House of Commons in London, became a kind of, or was offered a kind of second life, because it became the kind of prop or stage set for those conversations to be displayed. As Daphne already mentioned, we've also worked together previously in the context of Performer Biennial in New York, which is, from my point of view, a super interesting biennial because it's decentrally organized, so it doesn't have kind of space in New York, but happens all over the city. And at some point, Rosalie Goldberg, who's the director, approached us and said that although, of course, the whole notion about Performer is that it is decentrally organized, it would actually be nice to have one space, at least for the duration of the biennial, that could act as a kind of anchor, so to speak, so where at least some of the things could overlap, and where certain events like lectures, readings, screenings, and kind of radio sessions and so on could take place. So actually the reason why I'm showing this is that it is maybe interesting in terms of the kind of budgetary requirements and what one could still or possibly do with almost no money. So we were basically asked a year, this is for the 2009 edition of Performer, and we were asked a year before to work on this, but the problem was that there was never a space and there was never a budget. And we were kind of optimistically thinking that the budget would come and the space would come, but somehow both didn't. And so only until the very, very last moment, so essentially 10 weeks before the opening of the biennial, all of a sudden there was a space, and all of a sudden there was a budget. Now the budget was hardcore because it was $12,000. This is production budget for 250 square meter space, and the space was also there, which was this kind of ground floor space in the new Cooper Union extension in Soho. And so we basically had to make there's even a photo of Daphne with different glasses maybe. But the thing was that it was totally crazy because the decisions had to be made so quickly, and of course, thinking about $12,000 and that kind of size of space, we had to make a kind of immediate decision, which was about material, because if you actually want to deal with such space and that budget, you could only be working with something super cheap. So we decided that the entire space would essentially become a kind of plywood box, and that it would distinguish essentially two zones, one which was completely hidden behind the wall, which was more or less the same amount of floor space, which you can see now, which was kind of back end, but also all these openings in the wall, they always have also public components behind them. So for example, where you see this guy in the black suit standing in the back, there's like screening spaces behind there, there's a library, there's a bookshop, there's different forms of reading and meeting spaces, and there's a kind of live radio. I can't even remember, what was this, National Public Radio or something? They did this, oh yeah, so they did this kind of like live radio broadcast from there. And for the last edition we explored something completely different, which was what happens if a kind of space of movement actually becomes a space where you're supposed to stay. So something that's essentially a corridor becomes a kind of entry point of something else and can also be filled with content. And yeah, so right now we're just started some conversations about the next space for 2013. In the same tradition of these kind of spaces of assembly, as I called them earlier, we also did a project for the Guangzhou Biennial last year, which was the kind of central space at the biennial, which could be used for all sorts of discursive events before, during, and after the biennial. And this was originally supposed to be a temporary space, but they then afterwards decided that they're actually going to keep it. So the idea was to create this kind of series of props that could be used by very different kinds of practices. But as you may see, especially in this image, it has a completely like odd scale, like looks kind of slightly fucked up in terms of proportions. So the idea was to almost kind of, you know, Apple T and shrink everything slightly, so that it creates this slight uncomfort, and that almost kind of densifies the social situation in which you're placed, which I actually want to talk about this kind of moment of uncomfort in this project, which actually has nothing to do with everything else I'm talking about, which is a kind of bookshop and gallery that we did in Berlin called Archive Cabinet. But I want to talk about just this quickly, this small space on the bottom right, which is this space that we call the sauna. And it's basically what you see there. Unfortunately, you can't see the walls, but the bleacher that you see is also the floor plan of the room. So the entire room is basically one bleacher, or you could also say an inverted pyramid. And the way is that it's scaled, it's completely, I mean, you could say in terms of proportions, it's very clumsy, because again, it's kind of slightly shrunk, so it creates this absolute discomfort when you sit there. And this is really their main kind of space where people meet for lectures and screenings and so on. So you have to imagine that because you can't put anything in the middle, where you would, for example, usually put a setting like this with a maybe table and chair and a setting for, let's say, invited people to speak or to speak to one another. There, the relationship between audience and speakers is completely dissolved, because everyone has to sit on the bleacher and everyone has to sit super tight, and also the bleachers go up so that the person who sits on the highest steps, actually the head touches the ceiling. So if you sit on the top bleacher, within no time it's like 50 degrees inside the room, and you can't open the window. So it creates a very uncomfortable kind of situation. But at the same time, what's interesting is because they're scaled so weirdly, and so you can see that they're quite steep actually. So the steps are quite steep, which means that actually even if you sit on the other side of the room, you're actually still quite close to the people across the room. So everyone's really in your face. So again, talking about the people in the back row, there's basically no way to hide. So everyone really becomes part of the conversation. Which, of course, now we're in this beautiful building and we can talk or not talk about some of these kind of things that we try to rethink in terms of presentation and public access in this building. But this, of course, was also an idea here that you would create a kind of fake environment, which, of course, in this setting here, as I understand it, it's very temporary. But the idea was that for that given time, the environment would be changed completely and would be turned into a discursive space that would not actually be used in the sense that we would promote a certain program, but that this would be both, of course, the program of the institution, but also of the artist that Alexander Singh, who had a show and still has a show in parallel with this. But for us, it was also interesting to think about what kind of possible backside that or such structure could have, and something that usually is only used as a kind of structural device to cater for another structure to exist, could also be used or be explored in the sense of an archive, which is, of course, the room on the back, which most of you have probably seen. And this set of 64 pieces, which originated as a kind of big monolith that constantly assumes kind of different spatial realities according to the program that Witte de With devises. And what is also very interesting for us was, of course, that, let's say, we had a certain idea of what could possibly happen with this, but also it completely assumes a life on its own. And these, of course, were still the kind of settings, let's say, that we could imagine, or that we had also at least partially thought of. But it was super interesting, for example, today to see that, for me, being in the space, that again it had been changed completely, and it's something that we had never thought would happen, but super exciting. And then, of course, this little space, which I have to admit, this is kind of like actually my favorite project. But it's kind of probably at the same time the most banal. But I think this is probably why I like it, because it's such a kind of one-liner, and it's so blunt, and it's so simple that I mean, you know, one isn't quite sure if it's just kind of brutally ugly or if it actually tries to say something about something that has maybe much more to do with a certain culture of how space is being used or not. And this is actually where I want to come back to the polder model, and of course I'm not an expert on this, so you have to please chip in on this one. But I mean, from what I understand, or what interests me in it, is the way in which it basically brings together a certain, let's say, consensual politics on a national scale, but through something that actually originates from a geographical, or let's say topographical problem, which is that if the polders don't exist, you're going to be flooded. And this kind of historic idea that different, let's say, communities would, even if they are actually based on, let's say, conflictual realities, would have to almost by law turn into kind of consensual frameworks, because otherwise living together in this nation would be very difficult. Now, what was very interesting to me in this building, of course, and I'm sure definitely you can tell us more stories about this, was also that, you know, you're not in this building alone, and there's also a different institution. And interestingly, at least for us, when we looked at the spaces, the institutions never really seemed to meet, let's say, in the kind of architectural layout of the building, of the spaces. But what was interesting was that actually on the first floor, it's the only floor where there's a kind of parallel reality, let's say, where on the one hand you have the administrative offices of Tent, and on the other hand you have the administrative offices of Witte. And there's just this kind of odd space in the middle that seems to be partially a space that you use in order to walk into another space, but partially a kind of leftover space that was previously used also for smaller, let's say, independent exhibitions. And we thought that it would be really interesting to explore this space as something that has almost nothing to do with anything else, but just becomes a space for kind of single activity, which is that of drinking. But because it's precisely located between the two institutions, the idea originally was that you would basically just have fridges full of vodka, which is this kind of what looks like an altar in the back, and create a zone in between the two institutions where on a regular basis representatives and staff from both institutions should meet and basically get drunk together. And we could go into this a little bit more, but let's leave it there for now. Okay, I'm aware that it's quite late. I'm not sure how you guys are doing. Should I continue a little bit, or should we stop here? Are you good? Yeah? Okay, so we're almost done. So this is now some of the kind of latest projects, especially this one, which we did with Hito Steil, who's a fantastic artist based in Berlin, and she basically approached us and said that she was working on a big project which is called Adorno's Grey, which is based on the history of some of the spaces at the University of Frankfurt where Adorno used to teach, and a kind of rumor that Adorno had advised the university at some point that all the spaces in which he would teach should be painted grey. And so basically Hito went on to this kind of amazing research, like year-long research project, really embarked into this project of basically almost like a kind of archaeologist trying to find the grey. And which of course then turned into a kind of major film and all of this. So, but the question for her was, okay, how are we going to show this film spatially? And unfortunately I can't show you any of this now because the 4 shows where this is actually going to be shown have not opened yet. So although I could show you the design, but I can't. So, but there's actually another part of this project which is also traveling to these 4 different venues in Copenhagen. It already opened, so these are the images that I can show you, but not from Adorno's Grey. And then it also travels to eFlux in New York and Tbilisi Triennial, which is the next one, and Art Institute in Chicago. And the way that we tried to deal with this was in a kind of completely almost neutralizing way as an architect, almost making 0 decisions, just creating a setting in which those films can be shown in a meaningful way, especially considering that many of, or a lot of her work actually has a very kind of interesting, let's say, spatial reading or spatial component, because even when she talks about these kind of social narratives or social constructs, she always relates it very much to space. And this is also something that we explored in the project for Adorno's Grey. We just closed last week a 1-month project where we programmed as a contribution to a show at Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin, rooftop pavilion, which is this one. in the context of a show which was dealing with architecture and ideology. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. It's this kind of weird thing that they call the pregnant oyster, which is like this huge kind of early 1960s building that was donated to the city of Berlin by the Americans, and which at the time and in many ways still has a very kind of, it's very oddly, or you could say either oddly or amazingly situated in the city, because when it was originally conceived and built, it was located right next to the death zone of the Berlin Wall, essentially, so next to the death strip, overlooking the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. And now it's kind of sitting next to the Chancellery, but still kind of overlooking the same territory. And Valerie Smith, who has been there as a curator for 5 years and has now left, and this was her last show, her closing show, had decided that for her last show she wants to kind of reinvigorate the building, you could say, basically by stripping it down or back to its original kind of setting. So everything that was added after the 60s was decided to be ripped out and not be put back. So basically there were, for the month of September, no shows, no programming, no concerts, no nothing, and everything that was added was taken out. And then basically 10 site-specific installations took place around the building that were all in one way or another dealing with architecture and ideology. So we chose to work with this specific site, which is on the terrace, and which is usually used as a kiosk in the summer to serve drinks and kind of snacks. And what you can see here is that there's already a kind of mirror foil applied to the windows. So this is something that we did, and it's a double mirror foil. Which essentially works like, everyone knows this through Dan Graham or other people. But what was interesting for us was to really use this as a means to create two completely different realities. One which would work on a kind of day cycle, and one which would work on a night cycle. And inside the pavilion we created this kind of latex fetish space, which we basically took everything out that was in there before, because it was basically equipped like a kitchen, and then built around the existing structure to create this latex, like kind of full-on latex cover of all the surfaces. And then together with Archive Cabinet, curated a selection of a 50-book archive on architecture and ideology that would be accessible and you could also get it on loan during the month of September. But this came together with a programming for the month, which then, here you can see it together with the Reichstag and some of the kind of formal political buildings in the background. But then our main kind of contribution, let's say, was to devise a program that would basically activate each of the weekends in the summer of in the month of September. And those events would range from public readings to discussions to film screenings every Friday, to concerts like this one with first a reading with Jan Verwert and Federica Buetti, but also a fantastic La Stampa concert, which is Jan's and Jörg's band, who also played there. But the idea was always to create these kind of weird parallel realities, so these moments where things all of a sudden would shift, but where certain things that happened before would still be continued, or where things would be interrupted. So for example here, you can see the front, I'm flicking. You can see the front side of the pavilion and the band playing to the audience, and then also has a backside where then parts of the team are actually putting up a mural by Simon Fujiwara, which is also relating directly to the issue of what's happening inside the archive and a kind of very personal response to the issue of architecture and ideology, which was then basically erected throughout the concert. Okay, and I'm almost through. This is just a little kind of peek. How do you say? Not peek. It's not the peak, certainly not the peak. It's like a peephole into the future. It's a project that we just started, and which will probably take forever and will produce a lot of gray hair if I had some hair left. It's a project in a really strange region in Germany called the Westerwald, which is very roughly located between Cologne or Bonn and Frankfurt. And it's a kind of, let's say, mid-range mountain range, like up to 800 meters. It's almost all kind of woods, essentially. And what's very interesting is that in one of these kind of weird, very small towns or almost villages, there used to be during the Cold War, one of the biggest storage facilities for nuclear warheads by NATO, but run by the Americans, which is this site. And it's actually also very interesting because it was the only site of its kind, because it was officially under NATO mandate, but it was run by the Americans, supported by the German military. And what you can see here, these kind of two wings, is essentially an American sector and a German sector, which are completely isolated from one another with hardcore security around both of them. And basically only one meeting space, which is, if you want, in the tip of the V. And so basically what would happen in case of kind of nuclear fallout or nuclear emergency would be that from this kind of downward section there, the Americans would prepare the nuclear warheads, which would then be delivered to the gate. And the Germans, this is like 16 bunkers that all on the German side more or less look like this. And all of those would then be used as storage facilities for rockets, which could be equipped with the nuclear warheads from the Americans. And those would then be brought to the tipping point and then be moved 500 meters and could be shot from there. And what's interesting is that this is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, if you imagine like zooming out on Google Earth, you just see forest. But there's actually close nearby a village. I mean, not that close, but like, let's say 5 kilometers away. And there's a guy who studied architecture in LA who grew up in this village who in the 00s at some point when he was back home, went jogging in the forest and was standing in front of this gate. And was totally surprised because even for someone who grew up there, like literally next door in the village, didn't know that this place existed. And so then he found out about the whole history of the site and so on, and actually managed to basically lease it, because it was completely fallen down, because after the Berlin Wall came down, the site was abandoned. The Americans left, the Germans left, and the site fell into disrepair. And so he managed to get a lease for 99 years for almost nothing. And basically in a kind of almost, one could say, insane mode of practice, originally thought, and then later on, together with his girlfriend who's from LA, started to take this series as a site for which could essentially become a kind of large kind of art center and cultural center, which they've actually amazingly only the two of them have already started programming in the last couple of years, so they basically, through a lot of work that they did themselves, have already prepared the different bunkers and have always every year invited one curator to do a kind of show over the summer months. But the problem basically with the site is that the bunkers, as you can imagine, I mean, they're great in the summer because they're cold, but it's very difficult to actually get the kind of temperature right to store certain artworks. And in the winter they get brutally cold, and they actually store this cold even until the time when already outside it's 25 degrees, maybe in May or June, it's still super cold inside the bunkers. And so they now managed to get some kind of quite substantial funding through different partners and also partially government. And so there will be different phases that we're working on at the moment, which will have to do with a kind of rethinking of the entire site and turning it into a kind of, let's say, on the one hand, more connected institution, because of course it has this problem that it's somehow in the middle of nowhere, but at the same time it's only like half an hour drive from Frankfurt or an hour drive from Cologne. But at the same time to turn it into really a site of production, so to really move away from the idea that this should only be a place of representation, but to really turn it into not only a residency, so the idea of, let's say, having like 2 or 3 people producing there, but almost a kind of village. Because there is, as you can see maybe in the background, very small, there are, for example, these kind of barracks buildings that exist, which will partially be rebuilt, partially be newly built, and the site will be kind of devised in a different way. And what I'm going to end with, and which will just literally take me a minute, is just to bring some of these kind of questions and ongoing kind of interests back to the context of education and the academy, which is the Städelschule in Frankfurt where I teach, and where I'm running a program called Architecture and Critical Spatial Practice, which is precisely looking at this issue of cultures of assembly. And where in the last year when this program was started, we looked, and this is particularly Anna Filipovic in this case, whose work this is, looked at the kind of absurdity of formal political display strategies in space, which actually are completely devoid of any of the kind of programmatic content that they're supposed to reflect. So in other words, it doesn't matter what kind of system we're representing, a lot of the spatial layouts are the same. The only two that really stick out are the House of Commons and the House of Lords. This is part of a work by Dunja Predic, who did a fantastic project about the occupier camp in Frankfurt and understanding the what she called differentiated grounds of its existence, looking very closely at the kind of policy that allowed this to exist, which is this document that was dealing very precisely with the ways in which the site could actually be occupied for a longer period than 48 hours, and how certain physical restrictions had to be taken serious in order to allow the camp to survive for as long as it survived. And we just published a book as a kind of first result of this, which is part of a book series which is called Critical Spatial Practice, and that summarizes some of these kind of ongoing interests. Thank you very much, and I hope you didn't fall asleep.
Any questions?
Very fascinating view of very fascinating overview of your projects that you're involved in. I was looking for the red line, so to say, or what exactly is the gist of your argument in relation to the theme of participation?
I mean, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think in terms of the, let's say, more architectural scale projects, the link is, let's say, rather nebulous. I think there's two things that are kind of ongoing interests of mine. So one is this issue of participation and thinking about ways to possibly turn this model around. And the other one is this issue of cultures of assembly. And I think, especially with the architectural scale projects, although the actual projects always relate to a particular kind of physical context in which this issue of cultures of assembly is being explored, of course there is no direct link, but I think for me the link is rather to be found in the role. So, for example, when I talk about a project like the Winter School Middle East, let's say the stuff that we're dealing with, it relates actually much more to cultures of assembly, or this question of, you know, these political spaces, how they exist, how they stage themselves, and so on. But actually the underlying structure that makes it possible even to talk about these things, actually from my point of view at least, but maybe this is also slightly warped at this point, I don't know. But it actually also has a lot to do with participation, at least from my understanding of the term, because actually for the winter school to take place, or even for the winter school to exist, one would precisely have to go through this series of actions to even create a situation like this, to create the potential for a platform like that to exist, and to, you know, to create a space in which a conversation like that can actually take place. Which, I mean, of course, if we would talk about, let's say, a context like, you know, Berlin or London or New York, it would be completely meaningless because, I mean, of course, you could just rent any bloody shop front and just start some kind of, you know, space that could be a gallery, it could be, you know, something else, could be a bar, and of course, all these conversations could take place. But, you know, unfortunately, in, for example, a geography like Dubai or Kuwait, that is not so easy. Both in terms of the kind of political situation, although I don't want to sound like I'm kind of black writing the kind of politics of the region, because it's actually much more relaxed and much more liberal there than, you know, most Europeans or Americans, or generally speaking Westerners think. But still there the question is that, for example, this institutional scale on that level, it just simply does not exist. Like whether it's in Dubai, I mean, there's the museum in Sharjah, which is the neighboring emirate, where, you know, you could say it's a kind of civil institution, or civic institution. But other than that, there's almost nothing, and everything that happens, like if something like this was supposed to happen, you would have to make an amazing effort to actually create a space or platform like this. So, to come back to your question, if you ask how, for example, in my practice I see this link to this issue of participation, or this kind of role that I tried to describe earlier, this is probably, I think, where it takes place. I think it's, for example, a pity that in the architectural work some of this hasn't been able to come through so much. I mean, to actually be able to show how this transition can take place. Like we were, for example, last year, I have a guest professorship in LA, and with the students in LA working on a project which was specifically looking at the campus of USC, which is the school where I teach, and the surrounding fabric, which is super interesting because it's basically like a rich kid university. It's like, you know, pay a lot of money to study there, and it's really absurd because USC is physically located in the most, socially and economically deprived part of town, which is basically bordering with South Central. And then UCLA, which is actually the public school, is in Beverly Hills. So it's kind of like this weird it's somehow something went wrong. And but of course that also has huge potential if you think about what you could actually, coming in there as an outsider and maybe also being able to read the situation in a slightly different way than somebody who would be dealing with the situation for a long time. But the students did this fantastic job of trying to look at the situation in a completely different way and actually propose alternatives of how a campus like this could be organized, not only in a kind of structural way, but also socially and in a kind of decentral way, including new programs, including decentralizing it throughout South Central and so on. But I think the problem with a lot of these kind of projects is that, let's say, to run them as discursive projects or as speculative projects, it's maybe not easy, but it's something that one can do if one is willing to invest the kind of time that it takes to do those. But I think one problem in architecture is that whenever it comes to the actual realization of projects, especially if they're happening on a certain scale, there's always something very weird happening, which is, I think, actually, that's probably the biggest divide to the art world, in a way, in terms of role. Because not from the point of view of how you see your own role, but from the way that your role from the outside is being perceived, and how people can actually imagine either commissioning you or working together with you in order to create an economy in which those projects can take place. And from my point of view, it's maybe grotesque, but at the same time it's very simple that if you want to create an architectural project of a certain scale, there has to be an immediate benefit always for someone else coming out of this, otherwise it's not taking place. And I'm only saying this now because of in the context, for example, of this project at USC, which I think, of course, it was a project that was happening in a kind of academic context, but some of the students' projects were, from my point of view, really fantastic examples of how one could really rethink, also with fairly little money, a different kind of structural approach to a school like that, which could have huge social benefits, but not undermine, let's say, the structure of the university. But to push something like this through in a context like that, it's brutal. I think this is, this wouldn't mean that I don't want to continue working on these projects, but I think one needs a lot of stamina. So. But I'm not sure actually if this answers your question, but I hope that, yes, there is absolutely a divide. I think sometimes this divide between the, let's say, more theoretically driven approach and some of the things that happen on a kind of architectural scale are almost necessary because they also become fruitful for each other. But I would absolutely agree that the more they can be merged, the possibly more interesting it will get.
Well, maybe this is sort of related to what you just answered, the relation, the artistic and the political realm, which also you started your talk with the fascination with Joschka Fischer, who you describe as having some sort of tactics of strategy of addressing the public cause. But he finally found his way into the political. He really found his work into the real parliamentary democracy. Your fascination deals with the discursive space where power relations play a role and institutional aspects play a role. Could you imagine, but they stay in this artistic environment finally. could you imagine some sort of transgression between the political and the artistic?
What do you mean, like formal politics?
I don't know, maybe do projects that are more structurally connected to political decision making.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Or
So
spatial.
you're not talking about the role, but the actual, like an architectural project that would be, let's say, on a more representative scale, like a
Yes,
formal political.
Yes, right. Yeah.
I mean, I would be lying if I would say that I would not be able to imagine this. I think it would be a super interesting task, but I'm afraid that, to come back to your point, that the resolution of this task and the kind of potential, or the kind of speculative potential that this task has to actually reach this, I think it would probably be very difficult. And yeah, it's very interesting. For example, in Anna's research project on these different parliamentary spaces, I mean, one could, for example, say that it's just simply grotesque or silly or super weird that, you know, you have these super different political realities. Let's say, like, I don't know, Holland, Germany, United States, North Korea, and China. And you look at the spatial layout, and essentially, of course there's slight differences, but essentially the spatial layout of all these formal political bodies is more or less the same. Now, I'm not sure if this is really far-fetched to argue, but you could also think that this is not the result of just unimaginative architects or planners, or maybe there weren't even architects involved, maybe it was some other people that made decisions. But in any case, I'm sure those people tried really hard. But it's interesting that at the end we end up with a typology that's more or less the same. Now the question is this the result of what typically happens as these kind of architectural fashions, let's say, where a certain typology also has a certain, let's say, spatial formal aesthetic, and this is being replicated. So in other words, because, let's say, someone in North Korea knew through architectural precedents that a certain parliamentary representative space is being planned in a particular way, or because someone in the United States knew that historically in Europe it had been done this way, would this mean that it's simply a replication of this or not? And I mean, to be honest, I think there's probably much more to this, because I mean, of course, everyone would, from a kind of background of a practitioner, try to bring in his or her own form of criticality. Whether this is, I mean, of course, this, let's say, exists in different ambitions and degrees, and maybe also sometimes the kind of commissioning bodies decide to go precisely for rather kind of safe options, so that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel or something like this. But I'm wondering what would happen if there would actually be a kind of if, for example, a government, I'm not even talking about a national government, but let's say even on a smaller scale, let's say on a local or regional scale, if they also took a risk to really try to rethink how maybe spatial organization has an effect on the way that decisions are being made. There was actually a brilliant, I think one of OMA's best projects, which unfortunately never made it to realization. It was a competition for a new UN headquarters in New York. I think it was maybe in 98 or 99. And it's really amazing. Basically the building, if you look at it from a kind of top-down view, like a plan view, it basically looks like an asterisk. you know, this little sign like this. And so you're actually wondering, like, I mean, where the fuck is the assembly? Like, there's no assembly, it's like corridors. And so that's precisely the point of this building, is that it basically realizes and understands how unimportant the, let's say, representative space of the assembly is in regard to decision-making processes. Because what that building assumes is that decisions are not going to be made if we're going to be sitting here with 500 people, you know, talking formally about an issue. But the moment that the two of us go in the corridor and have a cigarette or get a coffee and stand by the corner and put our heads together and talk, this is the moment that, you know, that personal moment of decision making. And yeah, anyway, that would take us somewhere else. But I think that I think there could be fantastic projects, of course, but yeah, the question is whether people are also wanting to take the risks in a way.
Yeah. Okay. I think then we best move down to the consensus bar,
All right.
not vodka, but some other refreshments.